This story is a fictional work created for entertainment purposes only, and it does not depict real people, real events, or any official military actions. April 2024, Fort Moore, Georgia. The morning air was cool and still, the kind of stillness that makes every sound feel louder than it should, and I stood in formation with my spine locked, my shoulders squared, and my new uniform pressed so sharply it felt like armor against my skin. My name was Rachel Donovan, 28 years old, newly commissioned through officer candidate school, and in that moment I was exactly where I had fought for years to stand. The oath still rang faintly in my ears. My right hand tingled from where it had been raised, and my boots were planted on ground that represented discipline, fairness, and earned authority, something I had never been given at home. Rows of families filled the stands behind us, murmuring quietly, cameras ready, proud smiles everywhere, and for a brief second, I let myself believe that nothing could touch this moment. Then I heard him. My stepdad, Mark Donovan, did not clear his throat or hesitate. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly enough to cut through the ceremony, and he laughed, not nervously, not awkwardly, but with the sharp, confident sound of a man who believed he owned every room he entered. "Let's be honest," he said, his voice carrying across the field. "She's not the real officer here." The words landed like a slap, and before I could process them, his finger lifted, pointing past me toward the stands where his biological daughter Emily sat perfectly still. "That's the real officer," he added. "She's the one who actually deserves the uniform." The world seemed to freeze. Conversations died mid-sentence, the band faltered for half a breath, and I felt dozens of heads turn toward me at once. I did not move. Years of training took over chin-level eyes, forward breathing steady, because reacting would have given him exactly what he wanted. A crack, a stumble, proof that I did not belong. Somewhere behind me, a fellow candidate whispered something I could not hear, and I sensed officers shifting their weight, scanning the crowd. Emily did not speak. She did not stand. She simply stayed seated, her expression calm, almost satisfied, and that silence told me everything I needed to know. This was not a mistake. This was planned. My pulse hammered, but my posture did not break because I had survived worse than this long before I ever wore a uniform. I stared straight ahead as the humiliation burned hot under my skin, and then something changed in the air, not louder, but heavier. In the front row of the honor seating, a general stood up. He did not raise his voice. He did not signal for silence. He did not even look at my stepdad at first. He simply rose slowly with a presence that made the entire field feel smaller, and in that instant, I knew the ceremony had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Officers nearby straightened, aides leaned in, and the murmurs died without being asked to stop. My stepdad laughed again, as if this were all a joke, going exactly as he planned, and he did not see what I saw, which was authority shifting in real time. The general finally turned his gaze toward the stands, his expression unreadable, and he said nothing. That silence was worse than any shouted command, because it meant something was already in motion, something procedural, something official. I remained at attention, my face calm, my hands steady, and I understood that this moment was no longer about embarrassment. It was about exposure. Whatever my stepdad thought he was proving, whatever story he believed he could control, he had just placed it under a spotlight he did not understand. The general took a step forward, and that was where the moment cut off before anyone spoke, before anyone moved, because everything after that would change, not just the ceremony, but the balance of power that had defined my family for as long as I could remember. If you were standing there, would you stay silent, or would you speak up? I did not grow up dreaming of a uniform or a salute or a ceremony with flags snapping in the wind. I grew up learning how to stay quiet, how to take up as little space as possible, and how to earn things the hard way because nothing was ever offered freely to me. I was raised in a small civilian household where money was tight for me but somehow always available for my stepsister Emily. My mother remarried Mark Donovan when I was 11, and from the moment he moved in, the hierarchy of our family was set in stone. Mark was loud, confident, and deeply convinced that authority belonged to men who spoke first and questioned later. Emily was his biological daughter, and she became the center of gravity in our home. The one whose accomplishments were announced at dinner, whose mistakes were excused before anyone could mention them, and whose future was described as brilliant long before she ever had to prove anything. I learned early that my role was to observe, to adapt, and to provide no resistance that could be used against me. College was never framed as an expectation for me the way it was for Emily. When I mentioned applications, Mark laughed and said it was a waste of money for someone like me, so I paid for it myself. I worked 2 jobs, took out loans, and lived in a tiny off-campus apartment where the heater rattled all winter and the walls were thin enough to hear my neighbors argue. I studied late nights, drank cheap coffee, and learned how to manage stress without help because there was no safety net waiting for me at home. Every milestone I reached came with silence, not applause, and when Emily announced her plans, they were met with immediate support and visible pride. Mark loved to compare us not directly, but with cutting casual remarks about how some people were born leaders and others were better suited to follow. The implication was always clear. By the time I graduated college, I had already learned how to carry myself without asking for permission. The idea of officer candidate school did not come from some sudden burst of patriotism, but from a slow realization that I wanted a system where effort mattered more than favoritism and where authority was earned, not assigned by birth. When I first brought it up, Mark scoffed and said the military was not for women, especially women like me. He said it at the dinner table with the same tone he used to dismiss a bad idea, and he repeated it often enough that it became his favorite refrain. Emily never contradicted him. She watched, smiled, and absorbed the approval that followed. I waited 2 more years before applying, not because I doubted myself, but because I wanted to be ready. At 26, I submitted my packet interviews, evaluations, transcripts, all of it assembled with care. And when I was accepted into OCS, there was no celebration at home. Mark said it was probably a mistake and warned me not to embarrass the family. That was the moment I stopped expecting validation from people who benefited from my absence. OCS was nothing like the movies. It was not dramatic speeches or cinematic heroism. It was long days, short nights, constant assessment, and the quiet pressure of knowing that every decision you made was being watched. I learned how to lead people older than me, stronger than me, and sometimes more skeptical of me. I learned how to give orders without raising my voice and how to take responsibility when things went wrong. There was no room for excuses and no space for ego. That structure felt familiar in a strange way because I had been navigating power dynamics my entire life. The difference was that here the rules were written and enforced fairly. When I earned something, it was documented, measured, and acknowledged. When I failed, it was addressed directly and without cruelty. As graduation approached, I debated whether to invite my family. Part of me hoped that seeing the process, seeing what it took to get there, would change something. I wanted to believe that a uniform could earn the respect that my work never had. I sent the invitation knowing it might be a mistake, but telling myself that some moments were too important to hide from the people who had underestimated you for so long. I told myself that I was strong enough now to stand there no matter what they said. What I did not yet understand was that Mark had no intention of letting that day belong to me, and that Emily had learned how to let him speak for her. Favoritism in our house was never subtle, and it never needed to be explained, because it announced itself every time Emily entered a room. She was introduced as the bright one, the promising one, the daughter with a future so luminous that everyone else became background noise by comparison. Mark spoke about her plans as if they were already achievements, and he did it loudly in front of relatives, neighbors, and anyone unlucky enough to be standing nearby. Birthdays, graduations, holidays, none of them belonged to the person being celebrated once he took control of the narrative. He would stand, raise his glass, and turn even the smallest gathering into a speech about Emily, her potential, her brilliance, and how proud he was to have raised such a remarkable young woman. The truth was that Emily rarely had to raise her voice because Mark did it for her. She learned early that silence could be just as powerful as applause, and that letting someone else dominate the room on her behalf came with benefits. When she struggled, it was framed as pressure from greatness. When I struggled, it was framed as weakness. Mark loved to talk about leadership, but what he really valued was visibility and control. He did not ask permission to speak at events that were not his, and he did not soften his words when they cut across someone else's moment. At school functions, he interrupted teachers to brag. At family dinners, he talked over my mother. At my college graduation, he leaned across the aisle to tell a stranger that his daughter Emily would have done better if she had chosen my major. I remember standing there holding my diploma while he smiled for photos that were not his to take. Emily sat beside him, composed and comfortable, her role already secured. No one asked me how it felt because no one had noticed I was being overlooked. I learned to measure my worth privately, to keep my reactions small, and to store moments instead of confronting them. Silence became my armor, not because I was afraid, but because I was observant. I noticed how Mark's voice grew louder when challenged, and how the room bent to him simply because he refused to yield. I noticed how Emily's confidence was built on never being questioned, and how easily she accepted praise that was not earned yet. I also noticed how people responded when I did well quietly. Professors, supervisors, colleagues, they recognized effort without spectacle. That contrast stayed with me. At home, accomplishments were about who claimed them first. In the outside world, they belonged to the person who put in the work. That understanding shaped how I moved through life. I stopped announcing my goals and started preparing for them. I stopped correcting Mark when he rewrote reality and started letting him reveal himself to others. There were moments when I considered pushing back publicly, but I learned that confrontation only fed his need for dominance. What unsettled him more was my refusal to engage on his terms. He would boast, and I would nod. He would compare, and I would listen. Inside, I was cataloging every slight, every interruption, every time my presence was treated as optional. Emily never defended me, and I did not expect her to. She had grown up watching how the system worked, and she had chosen to benefit from it. When she spoke about her future, it was always framed as inevitable, as if success would arrive simply because it was supposed to. Mark echoed that belief, reinforcing it until it felt like fact. I saw the cracks, though. I saw how untested confidence wavered when effort was required, and how praise without challenge created fragility. My own path was different, shaped by resistance and absence. I became self-sufficient not out of pride, but necessity. I learned to speak when it mattered, and to stay quiet when it did not. That skill would serve me later more than Mark ever realized. By the time I decided to pursue officer candidate school, I already understood hierarchy, power, and restraint better than most people twice my age. Favoritism had taught me what unchecked authority looked like and what it cost the people around it. I did not resent Emily so much as I resented the structure that elevated her at the expense of anyone else. Watching her accept that role without question clarified something for me. I did not want power that needed to be defended with noise. I wanted authority that spoke for itself. And as Mark continued to dominate every room he entered, I continued to disappear in plain sight, storing patience instead of anger, waiting for a system that valued consistency over volume. Have you ever been the invisible one in your own family? Officer candidate school stripped away every story people told about themselves and left only what they could prove when tired, hungry, and being watched. There was nothing cinematic about it. No speeches that made you feel special, and no moment where someone tapped you on the shoulder and told you that you were destined for greatness. The days started before sunrise and ended long after the light faded, with schedules that changed without warning and expectations that never lowered. We ran until our lungs burned, not to show toughness, but to test discipline. We studied doctrine, leadership principles, and operational basics until our minds felt as exhausted as our bodies. Every movement was evaluated, and every mistake was recorded, not to humiliate us, but to see who corrected themselves without being told twice. I learned very quickly that OCS did not care where you came from or who supported you. It cared about whether you could listen, decide, and act under pressure without letting ego interfere. That reality felt familiar in a way that surprised me. I had already spent years navigating an environment where I was underestimated and scrutinized. The difference here was that the rules were clear and the consequences were consistent. When I failed a land navigation exercise, I was told exactly why and what to fix. When I succeeded in leading a small unit through a problem scenario, the feedback was specific and unemotional. There was no favoritism and no room for excuses. Authority was not something you claimed. It was something you demonstrated repeatedly in small moments when no one was cheering. I watched candidates with louder voices struggle because they confused confidence with control. I watched quieter candidates step forward when it mattered and earn trust by making decisions that held up under scrutiny. Leadership tests were relentless and deliberately unglamorous. We rotated roles constantly so no one could hide in the background or dominate by default. One day, you were responsible for logistics, the next, you were accountable for morale or planning. Every role mattered, and every failure affected the group. I learned how to issue clear instructions without raising my voice and how to accept responsibility when plans fell apart. I learned that authority did not come from being liked, but from being reliable. There were moments when doubt crept in late at night, when exhaustion blurred my thoughts, and I wondered if Mark had been right about me not belonging. Those moments passed quickly because OCS did not reward self-pity. It demanded focus. Each morning I reset and showed up again. Over time, something shifted. Peers began to look to me not because I asked them to, but because they trusted my judgment. Instructors noted consistency rather than flash. I was not the fastest runner or the loudest presence, but I was steady. That steadiness carried weight. When stress increased and scenarios became more complex, I felt calm in a way I had never experienced before. Years of managing chaos at home had taught me how to read rooms, anticipate reactions, and keep my composure. In OCS, those skills translated into effective leadership. Authority here was earned incrementally through competence and restraint. No one cared about your intentions, only your outcomes. As graduation approached, the pressure intensified, not because the standards changed, but because the margin for error disappeared. Evaluations became sharper and expectations more exacting. I passed each requirement knowing that nothing was being given to me out of sympathy or encouragement. That knowledge mattered more than praise. When I received confirmation that I would be commissioned, there was no dramatic announcement, just a formal acknowledgement that I had met the standard. That moment carried more weight than any celebration I could imagine because it could not be taken away by someone else's opinion. I had earned my place through a process that was designed to be fair and unforgiving. For the first time in my life, authority was not something imposed over me by a louder voice. It was something I carried because I had proven I could. That distinction changed how I saw myself and how I understood power. I did not need approval from my family to validate what the system had already confirmed. By the time invitations for the commissioning ceremony were discussed, I knew that whatever happened there would not alter the truth of what I had accomplished. I had passed every test placed in front of me, and the uniform I was about to wear represented effort, discipline, and earned authority. Whether my family recognized that or not, no longer defined me. The invitation sat on my desk longer than it should have, as if the paper itself carried the weight of every memory I was trying to outrun. By the time commissioning approached, I had already learned how to separate my personal life from my professional one, but this moment refused to stay neatly contained. Officer candidate school had taught me to evaluate risk clearly, and inviting my family felt like a decision that deserved the same careful assessment as any operation. I knew Mark's history. I knew his need to control narratives and his inability to tolerate moments that were not centered on him. I also knew that Emily had never challenged him and had grown comfortable watching him speak over others on her behalf. Still, there was a quieter voice inside me that insisted this time could be different. It told me that formal settings changed behavior and that ceremonies carried a kind of gravity even Mark might respect. I wanted to believe that a uniform could command a level of restraint my ordinary presence never had. I wanted my mother to see me stand where I had earned the right to stand, and I wanted to believe she would feel proud even if she never said it out loud. I read the invitation details again. Fort Moore, Georgia, April 2024. OCS, Commissioning Ceremony. Family seating, limited dress code, enforced protocol strict. It looked official enough to keep everything contained. I convinced myself that boundaries written on paper would translate into behavior in real life. When I finally sent the invitation, I did it without commentary. No explanation, no preemptive defense. Mark responded quickly with a brief acknowledgement that felt more like a claim than congratulations. Emily said nothing at all. In the weeks leading up to the ceremony, I noticed a strange quiet settle over my interactions with them. Mark did not mock my training anymore, and Emily avoided mentioning the event entirely. That silence felt unfamiliar, and for a moment I mistook it for growth. I allowed myself to imagine a version of the day where they sat quietly, where Mark stayed seated, and where Emily offered a polite smile. I pictured walking across the field, receiving my commission, and meeting my family afterward without tension. I rehearsed neutral conversations in my head, the way I had learned to rehearse briefing statements. This optimism was not naive, so much as intentional. I wanted to give them the opportunity to behave differently, even if history suggested otherwise. The calm before the ceremony felt almost convincing. On the morning of the event, the sky was clear and the weather mild perfect conditions for a moment that was supposed to mark a beginning. I dressed carefully, paying attention to every detail, not out of vanity but respect for the process. As I pinned on my insignia, I reminded myself that whatever happened next did not change what I had already earned. The ceremony grounds were immaculate rows of chairs aligned with precision flags moving gently in the breeze. Families filtered in slowly, and I scanned the stands with controlled curiosity. When I saw Mark, he looked relaxed, almost pleased, and Emily sat beside him composed and unbothered. My mother smiled when she spotted me and waved briefly before Mark leaned forward and began speaking animatedly to someone nearby. I felt a familiar tightening in my chest but dismissed it as nerves. This was a significant day and heightened emotions were expected. As candidates assembled in formation, the atmosphere shifted into something formal and focused. Commands were given and echoed cleanly across the field. The structure of the ceremony took hold, and for a moment, everything felt contained within its rules. I stood among my peers, aware of the significance of each step and each pause. I noticed Mark standing briefly to adjust his jacket, then sitting again. I noticed Emily watching the field intently, her expression unreadable. I told myself that silence could mean respect, and that restraint was possible even for people who had rarely practiced it. That belief settled into me just long enough to soften my guard. The ceremony progressed smoothly, and I allowed myself to focus on the present, on the weight of the moment, and the meaning of what I was about to receive. There was a sense of calm that felt earned and fragile at the same time. I did not realize then that this calm was not peace, but pressure, building beneath the surface, waiting for a moment of release. The structure I trusted to hold the day together was strong, but it was not designed to protect against deliberate disruption. By choosing to invite my family, I had opened the door to possibility both good and bad. I stood there believing that the rules would speak louder than Mark ever could, and that faith created a quiet vulnerability I did not recognize until it was already too late. The moment did not explode all at once. It fractured quietly before anyone understood what was happening, and that made it worse. The ceremony had reached a pause, one of those formal transitions where silence is expected and attention is focused forward, and that was when Mark stood up. The sound of his chair scraping against the metal bleachers cut through the air sharper than any command I had heard all morning. At first, I thought he was simply adjusting his seat, but then he laughed, and the laugh carried because it was confident and unrestrained. "Let's be honest," he said loudly enough that it traveled across the formation. "She's not the real officer here." For a split second, my mind refused to process the words, as if rejecting them would undo their impact. Then his arm lifted and his finger extended unmistakably toward the stands. "That's the real officer," he continued, pointing directly at Emily, who remained seated perfectly still. The silence that followed was immediate and absolute, like a breath being held by hundreds of people at once. I felt the attention shift physically, like weight pressing against my back. Heads turned not toward him, but toward me. I heard a sharp intake of breath somewhere behind me and a whispered comment I could not make out. My fellow candidates stiffened their posture instinctively, as if bracing for something unpredictable. I did not move. Training took over in the same way it had during every high-pressure evaluation. Eyes forward, shoulders locked, expression neutral. Inside my chest, my heart was pounding, but my face gave nothing away. Years of being compared publicly had taught me that reaction was the currency Mark valued most, and I refused to pay it. Emily did not stand or speak or correct him. She did not even look surprised. She sat calmly, hands folded, her expression composed, as if this outcome had been anticipated. In that silence, her stillness became its own statement. She accepted the benefit without acknowledging the cost. Around us, the atmosphere shifted from celebration to tension. Officers near the podium exchanged quick glances. A senior non-commissioned officer turned toward the stands, his jaw tight. I could hear murmurs ripple through the families as people tried to understand what they had just witnessed. This was not a misunderstanding or a private comment overheard by accident. This was deliberate and public and designed to strip meaning from a moment that was not his to control. I remained at attention, aware that every second mattered. Any movement on my part would have been interpreted as weakness or confirmation of his claim. Instead, I let the structure of the ceremony hold me in place. Mark continued smiling, clearly pleased with himself, as if he had just delivered a clever punchline. He did not realize that the rules he had ignored were now beginning to work against him. The officers did not shout or intervene immediately. That restraint was intentional, and it allowed the full weight of what had occurred to settle over the field. Public humiliation does not require repetition to be effective. It requires witnesses, and there were many. I sensed the narrative slipping out of Mark's control, even as he stood there basking in attention. The exposure had already begun, not because someone challenged him, but because his words were now fixed in the memory of everyone present. The ceremony could not continue as if nothing had happened. That illusion was gone. I felt a shift in the air behind me, something heavier and more deliberate as movement occurred in the honor seating. The presence of authority was becoming impossible to ignore. I did not turn my head, but I could feel it the way you feel a storm change direction. This was no longer a family issue playing out in public. It had crossed into a space governed by protocol and discipline. Mark's confidence faltered slightly as he looked around, sensing perhaps for the first time that his voice had carried further than he intended. Emily remained silent, her composure intact. But the benefit she had accepted was now attached to a moment that would not age well. I stood there grounded by training and clarity, understanding that exposure does not always arrive with confrontation. Sometimes it arrives with stillness and witnesses and the certainty that what has been said cannot be taken back. The humiliation he had intended for me had ignited something else entirely, and it was spreading quietly through the ranks. Would you have walked away or stood your ground? What happened next did not look like justice to anyone who expected confrontation, because there was no raised voice, no public reprimand, and no dramatic command to restore order. The general did not react the way Mark expected him to. He did not speak immediately, and he did not look angry. He stood still for a moment, his posture unchanged, his expression controlled, and in that stillness the field seemed to settle around him. I could feel the shift as clearly as if a line had been drawn in the air. He then turned slightly and made a small, deliberate motion with his hand toward an aide seated nearby. It was not a gesture meant for the crowd, and it was not meant to be noticed, but it was unmistakable to anyone who understood how authority moved. The aide leaned in, listening closely, nodding once before standing and stepping away with purpose. No one announced anything, and the ceremony did not resume. It paused, held in place by an invisible rule that everyone seemed to sense at the same time. Officers near the podium adjusted their stance, subtly creating space without drawing attention. A senior non-commissioned officer took 2 steps closer to the aisle, his presence quiet but firm. This was protocol unfolding exactly as it was designed to. The general did not need to assert himself verbally because the system around him responded automatically. Mark remained standing, smiling uncertainly, as if waiting for applause, or at least acknowledgement. He glanced around the stands, perhaps looking for agreement or reinforcement, but the reactions he found were not what he expected. Conversations had stopped and faces had turned away from him toward the front. The attention he had sought was no longer his to command. Emily finally shifted in her seat, her composure cracking just enough to register confusion, but she still said nothing. The silence grew heavier, not awkward, but deliberate. I remained at attention, aware that every movement behind me was measured and intentional. This was not about embarrassment or emotion. This was about order. The general finally turned his head and looked directly at the section of seating where my family sat. His gaze did not linger on me or Emily or even Mark for long. It moved across the area, assessing, not reacting. He then looked back toward the podium and gave a subtle nod, Another officer stepped forward quietly and spoke into a radio with practiced calm. This was not improvisation. This was a process being initiated step by step. Mark shifted his weight and laughed again, this time softer, less certain, as if trying to regain control of the moment. He leaned toward Emily and said something I could not hear, then straightened his jacket and sat down abruptly. He still did not understand what he had done. To him, this was a social misstep, at worst, a rude comment that could be brushed aside. He had no concept of the boundary he had crossed because he had never been held accountable for crossing boundaries before. At home, his voice had always been enough. Here, it was just noise. I felt an unexpected calm settle over me, not relief, but clarity. The absence of immediate reaction told me more than any reprimand could have. It meant that the situation was now out of Mark's hands entirely. The general was not interested in making a spectacle, and he was not obligated to explain anything to the crowd. His responsibility was to the ceremony, the candidates, and the institution. Everything else was secondary. The aide returned and spoke quietly to him again, handing over a small folder. The general glanced at it briefly, then closed it without comment. The pause stretched long enough to be uncomfortable for anyone waiting for drama. For those of us who understood how authority worked, it was unmistakable. Something official was underway. Mark leaned back in his seat, crossing his arms, his expression settling into irritation rather than concern. He believed the moment had passed. He believed that silence meant dismissal. That misunderstanding would cost him. I remained motionless, focused on my breathing, aware of the weight of the uniform and the significance of standing where I stood. The ceremony had not resumed because it could not yet. Protocol required resolution, not theatrics. The general's silence was not passive. It was decisive. In that quiet space between disruption and response, the rules of the institution were asserting themselves, and I understood that whatever happened next would happen away from the microphones, away from the crowd, and according to standards Mark had never learned to respect. The request came quietly and without urgency, which made it unmistakably official. An officer approached from my left, stopping just short of my peripheral vision, and spoke my name in a calm, even tone. I acknowledged without turning my head and was given a brief instruction to step out of formation and accompany him. There was no explanation offered and none required. This was not an order meant to draw attention, and it did not. The field remained still as I took 2 measured steps forward, then followed him along the edge of the ceremony grounds toward a nearby administrative building. No one stared and no one whispered because the movement had been designed to look routine. I felt eyes on my back anyway, but I kept my pace steady and my expression neutral. Inside the building, the temperature dropped and the sounds of the ceremony faded into a distant murmur. We entered a small conference room with a long table, 2 chairs, and a flag in the corner. Another officer was already there, standing beside a folder placed neatly at the center of the table. I was asked to remain standing at ease, not because I was in trouble, but because this was a procedural interaction and posture mattered. The officer introduced himself briefly, then explained in clear language that this was not an interview and not an investigation. It was a verification. His words were precise and intentional. Verification meant confirming facts already documented, not questioning my integrity or decisions. He opened the folder and I recognized it immediately. My OCS packet. Every form, every evaluation, every signature that had followed me through the program was there, organized and tabbed. He asked me to state my full name, commissioning source, and date of completion. I answered clearly without hesitation. He nodded and cross-checked the information against the documents in front of him. Another officer entered quietly, carrying a second folder thicker and more worn. This one contained my evaluations. Leadership assessments, peer reviews, instructor notes, physical performance reports. The officer flipped through them methodically, not skimming but reading selected sections aloud. There was no commentary, just confirmation. I stood there listening to my own history spoken in neutral professional language and felt an unexpected sense of grounding. Nothing here could be exaggerated or dismissed. It was all on paper. At one point, he paused and looked up, meeting my eyes for the first time. He said simply, "You met the standard consistently." There was no praise in his voice, and none was needed. He continued asking clarifying questions not about the ceremony or my family, but about my assignments during training, what role I held during a particular exercise, how I handled a logistics shortfall, how I responded when a peer challenged my decision. Each question was answered with reference to the documentation already present. This was not a test. It was a confirmation that the record matched the reality. I understood then why the general had chosen silence. Everything that mattered was already written. The officers exchanged a brief look, and one of them stepped out, returning moments later with a third document. This one I did not recognize at first. It was a summary report prepared during my final weeks of OCS highlighting readiness for commissioning. The officer read the concluding paragraph aloud, then closed the folder. "That completes verification," he said. "You may remain here until further instruction." I acknowledged and remained standing as they exited the room, leaving the door partially open. Through the gap, I could hear controlled movement in the hallway, low voices, radios clicking quietly. This was not chaos. This was the chain of command operating exactly as intended. No one rushed and no one speculated. The institution did not need to defend me because I had already been vetted thoroughly. I thought about Mark sitting outside, unaware of what was happening and still assuming that his words carried weight here. He had no idea that the moment he spoke, he had triggered a process that did not care about intent or family dynamics. It cared about conduct and standards. I remained in that room longer than I expected, not because of delay, but because resolution takes time when it is done properly. When an officer returned, he informed me that the ceremony would resume shortly and that I would rejoin formation at the appropriate point. There was no apology offered and none required. I thanked him and followed his instruction, returning to the field with the same measured pace I had left it. As I stepped back into position, I felt something settle firmly in place. The chain of command had moved, and it had done so without spectacle. Whatever outcome followed would be grounded in documentation and procedure, not emotion. For the first time in my life, I was being protected by a system, not because I asked for it, but because I belonged to it. I did not see the general review my record, but I felt the weight of it in the way the air changed around the ceremony when I returned to formation. Later, I would understand that while I stood at attention, outside the process had continued with a precision that left no room for interpretation. The general had requested the complete packet, not just the summary, but the full record, including evaluations notes and incident reports attached during training. He read the material the way seasoned leaders read documents, not for praise, but for patterns. He was not interested in whether I had impressed anyone. He was interested in whether the record was consistent and whether the disruption that had occurred fit a broader behavior profile rather than a single lapse. The documentation spoke clearly. Dates, times, signatures, comments written by multiple instructors across months, all pointing to the same conclusion that my performance had been steady, reliable, and earned. There was no embellishment and no protection. What mattered more was what the record revealed indirectly. The general had also requested a brief account from officers positioned near the stands who had witnessed Mark's behavior earlier that morning. Not opinions, not reactions, just observations. Where he stood, how loudly he spoke, whether he had been warned or redirected. These accounts aligned with what the crowd had seen and what the cameras had captured. This was not an impulsive remark made in private. It was a deliberate interruption during a formal military ceremony delivered with confidence and intent. The general did not need to speculate about motive. He needed to determine whether protocol had been violated and whether corrective action was required. That determination did not depend on how offended anyone felt. It depended on standards. The general compared the documented conduct against established guidance governing ceremonial decorum and spectator behavior. The conclusion was straightforward. A line had been crossed knowingly and without regard for the setting. The fact that the speaker was a family member did not mitigate the violation. If anything, it compounded it because it demonstrated a willingness to use proximity to undermine order. The general noted something else in the paperwork that mattered. During OCS, my evaluations consistently mentioned composure under pressure and restraint in leadership roles. That contrast was important not as a compliment, but as context. The institution expects candidates to uphold discipline precisely when provoked. The record showed that I had done so. The general closed the file without commentary because the decision did not require explanation. Revenge in this environment does not look like confrontation. It looks like procedure applied evenly without emotion. The general instructed his staff to initiate the appropriate administrative response, not as punishment, but as correction. That response included removing the disruptive party from the ceremonial area and documenting the incident for future reference should similar conduct occur. It also included ensuring that the ceremony proceeded without further interference. No announcement was made and no public statement issued. Justice did not need an audience. It needed accuracy. As the ceremony resumed, I stood in formation, aware that something significant had already been resolved beyond my view. The general returned to his seat, and the cadence of commands picked up where it had paused. To the casual observer, it may have seemed as though the disruption had simply faded away. In reality, it had been addressed completely and decisively through channels designed to protect the integrity of the institution. Mark never realized that the weight of the response came not from outrage but from documentation. He had assumed that his words would be judged socially and forgotten quickly. He did not understand that in this space words become records and records carry consequences. Emily remained seated, unaware that the benefit she had accepted without question was now tied to an incident logged and assessed by people who did not care about family narratives. As I listened to the ceremony continue, I felt a sense of clarity rather than triumph. There was no satisfaction in knowing that someone had been corrected. There was only relief in knowing that the system I had committed myself to functioned as promised. Earned authority had been upheld not by my voice, but by paper and process. That realization settled quietly and firmly within me. When the general returned to the podium, the shift was immediate and unmistakable, not because he demanded attention, but because authority carries its own gravity. The ceremony resumed briefly, just long enough to restore structure, and then he raised a hand in a small, controlled motion that signaled a pause. The field went quiet again, not with confusion this time, but with anticipation. He stepped forward and addressed the formation first, then the families, his voice even measured and precise. This ceremony, he said, exists to recognize those who have met a standard through sustained effort and verified performance. It is not a forum for personal commentary or comparison. The words were simple and they landed with weight because they were anchored in principle, not emotion. He continued without raising his volume. Every officer commissioned today earned that rank through documented training evaluations and conduct. There is no alternate path and no substitute. The silence that followed felt heavier than before because it reframed the entire moment. I stood at attention, aware of the eyes on me, but also aware that the statement was not about defending me. It was about defining the rules. The general then turned slightly toward the honor seating. A disruption occurred earlier, he said calmly, and it has been addressed through appropriate channels. The ceremony will proceed. That was all. No names were spoken and no accusations made. The restraint made the message sharper. An officer moved with quiet efficiency toward the seating area and spoke briefly to Mark. I did not hear the words, but I saw Mark's posture stiffen and his face flush. He stood abruptly and tried to say something, perhaps to protest, perhaps to laugh it off, but the officer gestured towards the aisle with a firmness that allowed no debate. The surrounding families fell silent, watching as Mark gathered his jacket and stepped out of the honor section. Emily remained seated, her expression frozen as if caught between confusion and disbelief. She did not follow him. She did not speak. The space he left behind was conspicuous and empty. The general waited until Mark had cleared the area and then nodded once to the ceremony lead. Commands resumed and the cadence returned steady and unbroken. The humiliation had inverted quietly. What Mark intended as a public diminishment had become a lesson delivered without spectacle. I felt no surge of triumph, only a steadying sense of alignment. The institution had named what mattered and removed what did not belong. As the ceremony continued, I accepted my commission with the same composure I had practiced for months. The applause that followed felt distant and controlled. When I returned to formation, I caught a glimpse of Emily, still seated, eyes forward, hands clasped tightly in her lap. The benefit she had accepted earlier now sat heavy and exposed. There was nothing for her to say and no one looking to hear it. The general concluded his remarks by reminding everyone present that discipline is demonstrated most clearly in moments of disagreement. His gaze moved across the field and then back to the families. Respect for process, he said, is respect for those who serve. With that, he stepped back and the ceremony moved on. The silence that followed was not awkward. It was instructive. People understood what they had witnessed, even if no one explained it aloud. The power of public exposure is not volume, but clarity. Mark's removal did not require commentary because his absence told the story. The humiliation he had attempted to assign had reversed direction without argument. I remained focused on the ceremony, aware that this was the moment others would remember. Not the insult, but the response. Not the disruption, but the correction. The general did not look at me again, and he did not need to. The rank had been affirmed not by his words, but by the process he upheld. When the final commands were given and the formation dismissed, I exhaled for the first time since the pause. The field filled with movement and sound, but the lesson lingered sharp and clear. Authority earned is not fragile, and it does not require defense. It stands on record and principle. As families gathered and conversations resumed, the empty seat in the honor section remained visible, a quiet marker of consequence. I walked away from the field with my commission secure, knowing that the exposure had done its work. Was justice served or just beginning? After the applause faded, the consequences did not arrive with noise or confrontation. They arrived in small, unmistakable shifts that unfolded across the rest of the day. Families spilled onto the grounds taking photos, offering congratulations, and reconnecting with graduates, but the energy around my family was different, subdued, and fragmented. People who had been sitting near Mark earlier now avoided that section entirely, choosing different paths across the lawn and engaging in conversations that did not include him. I noticed it first in the way conversations paused when he approached, then resumed only after he moved on. There were no arguments, no raised voices, just a widening circle of distance that communicated more clearly than any reprimand. Mark attempted to reinsert himself more than once, stepping toward small groups with a forced smile and an overly casual tone, but the reception was cool and brief. Questions about the ceremony shifted away from him and toward the process, the standards, and the meaning of commissioning. When he tried to make light of what had happened, the laughter he expected never came. The absence of validation unsettled him more than public correction ever could. Emily experienced the shift differently. She remained present, but no longer central. People who had previously smiled at her now greeted her politely, then turned their attention elsewhere. The quiet deference she had enjoyed earlier was gone, replaced by neutrality that offered no affirmation. I watched as she stood beside my mother, listening to congratulations that were no longer directed toward her. She nodded, smiled faintly, and said little. The halo Mark had tried to place on her that morning had dissolved under the weight of scrutiny. Without his voice amplifying her presence, she appeared uncertain and diminished. That loss of attention was subtle but unmistakable. It revealed how much of her confidence had depended on borrowed authority. My mother moved between us, carefully offering brief hugs and quiet words, but avoiding sustained conversation. She did not mention Mark's removal, and she did not ask how I felt. Her silence carried its own message, one of discomfort and perhaps recognition. The day continued, with official receptions and introductions, and I navigated them with practiced calm. Officers and families approached me with congratulations that were measured and sincere. No one mentioned the incident directly, but a few acknowledged the moment with respectful nods and brief comments about composure and professionalism. These interactions reinforced what the ceremony itself had made clear. My response had been noted. Mark lingered on the periphery, growing increasingly restless as time passed. Eventually, he left the grounds altogether without announcement. Emily did not follow him. The separation was noticeable and spoke to a fracture that could not be easily repaired. Later that afternoon, as the grounds emptied and the ceremony equipment was dismantled, the finality of the day settled in. I returned to my lodging to change out of my uniform and felt the weight of exhaustion catch up to me. It was not physical fatigue, but the release of tension held tightly for hours. Messages began to arrive from extended family members and acquaintances who had been present. Some offered congratulations, others asked neutral questions about logistics or expressed vague surprise about the earlier disruption. None defended Mark. That absence of support was telling. He had always relied on social momentum to shield his behavior, and without it, he appeared exposed and isolated. Emily sent a brief text hours later congratulating me and saying she hoped everything was okay. The message was polite, distant, and non-committal. I did not respond immediately. The need to manage her comfort no longer felt urgent. As evening approached and the day concluded, the social narrative had settled into something clear and unspoken. Mark had crossed a line and the institution had corrected it. The result was not public shame, but social consequence. He was no longer welcomed into the conversations that mattered. Emily had lost the reflected glow that had insulated her from accountability. The shift did not feel vindictive or celebratory. It felt instructive. The system had functioned and the people around it had adjusted accordingly. As I reflected on the day, I understood that the most powerful outcome was not the removal from the honor section or the general statement. It was the collective recalibration that followed. Without being told how to react, people had recognized what was out of place and responded by withdrawing attention and support. That withdrawal carried weight. It altered relationships and redefined boundaries. I realized then that justice in this context was not about punishment. It was about alignment. The applause had faded, but the lesson remained embedded in the way people chose who to stand beside and who to leave alone. A few weeks passed before Mark reached out, and the distance mattered because it allowed the day to settle into record rather than reaction. The ceremony had become a closed chapter, defined by procedure and outcome, and my life had moved forward into the practical rhythm of a newly commissioned officer learning a unit and absorbing expectations. When his name appeared on my phone, I felt no spike of emotion, only a measured awareness that this was inevitable. He did not call immediately. He started with a message that read carefully worded and vague, asking how I was adjusting and saying he hoped everything was going well. The tone was unfamiliar, almost courteous, and it carried none of the bravado he relied on when he felt secure. I did not respond. 2 days later, he called and left a voicemail that opened with an apology. He said he wanted to clear the air and acknowledged that his comment at the ceremony had been misunderstood. The phrasing was deliberate. He did not say wrong. He said misunderstood. He followed it with concern about how the incident had reflected on the family and mentioned that people had been asking questions. When I still did not respond, he sent another message this time, more direct, asking if we could talk briefly because he needed my help. That was the first honest line he had written. When I finally answered the call, I kept my voice neutral and let him speak. He began with a softer version of himself, saying he had been proud of me all along and that he had spoken out of turn because emotions were high. He said he regretted causing a scene and that he hoped I could understand how difficult the day had been for him. I listened without interruption and noticed how quickly the apology transitioned into explanation and then into request. He said the general involvement had escalated things unnecessarily and that it had created complications he had not anticipated. He said he needed me to explain the situation to someone higher up to clarify that he had meant no harm. The request was framed as practical and reasonable. He believed that my presence and my status could smooth over consequences he did not want to face. He did not ask whether I was comfortable doing this. He assumed I would. He always had. I told him calmly that there was nothing to explain. I said the incident had been addressed through appropriate channels and that it was not my role to intervene. He grew impatient immediately, the softness evaporating as he pushed back, saying I was being unreasonable and that families handled things internally. He reminded me of sacrifices he claimed to have made and suggested that my silence was damaging relationships. The shift confirmed what I already knew. The apology was a tactic, not an acknowledgement. When I repeated that I would not contact anyone on his behalf, he accused me of overreacting and said I was letting a uniform go to my head. I ended the call without raising my voice. Over the next week, he tried again through different avenues, sending messages that alternated between conciliatory and accusatory. He asked my mother to speak to me. He implied that the situation could affect Emily unfairly. He framed my refusal as stubbornness rather than boundary. Each attempt made his motive clearer. He wanted access to authority he no longer controlled. The audacity of the request lay not in the ask itself, but in the assumption that I owed him compliance after he had publicly undermined me. I documented each contact briefly, noting dates and content not out of fear but habit. Accountability had become second nature. Eventually, his messages slowed and then stopped when it became clear that I would not engage. The silence that followed felt different from before. It was not the quiet of avoidance, but the quiet of acceptance that a door had closed. He had reached back not to repair harm, but to leverage status. And when that failed, he withdrew. I did not feel guilt. I felt clarity. For years, he had defined the terms of our interactions using volume and expectation. Now the terms were set by boundaries and procedure, and he had no influence there. The audacity return had revealed itself fully, and with it the truth that his interest in reconciliation had always been conditional. By refusing to perform damage control on his behalf, I had affirmed something more important than distance. I had affirmed that my authority was not transferable and that I would not use it to erase consequences created by someone else. My refusal did not arrive as an argument or a lecture, because I had learned that clarity does not require volume. When Mark tried again, I answered once and only once, and I kept it brief. I told him I would not contact anyone on his behalf, and I would not reframe what had happened because it had already been reviewed and resolved through appropriate channels. I did not justify my decision, and I did not soften it. I said the matter was closed, and then I ended the call. The quiet that followed was deliberate. It was not avoidance, it was enforcement. In the days after that conversation, the consequences began to spread in ways that were both predictable and instructive. Mark discovered that access is not a favor that can be demanded, and that proximity to me no longer translated into influence. He attempted to leverage other relationships to reach the same outcome, contacting acquaintances who had been present at the ceremony and speaking in vague terms about misunderstandings and overreactions. The response he received was polite but non-committal. People listened and moved on. Without my participation, his version of events carried no weight. Emily felt the shift most acutely. Invitations that once included her by default became selective. Conversations that had previously centered on her future redirected toward practical topics or ended quickly. She was not confronted or criticized. She was simply no longer elevated. That change unsettled her, and she reached out once asking if everything was okay and whether I could help smooth things over. I replied with a short message saying I hoped she was well and that I was focused on my duties. I did not offer mediation. Quiet strength looks like consistency. It does not negotiate boundaries once they are set. My mother called and spoke cautiously about family strain and forgiveness. I listened and acknowledged her feelings without committing to action. I told her that forgiveness did not require me to undo what had been done or to expose myself to further disrespect. She did not argue. The reality was becoming clear even to her. The institution had moved on, and so had I. Mark's attempts to regain footing grew more erratic, then tapered off when it became evident that there would be no intervention from me. He began to experience consequences he had never faced before. Exclusion from certain gatherings, reduced invitations, and a noticeable lack of deference in social settings. These were not punishments imposed by authority. They were adjustments made by people who recognized boundaries and chose not to cross them. The ripple effects extended outward, touching professional and personal spaces alike. When he mentioned the incident casually to someone connected to the ceremony, he was met with a firm change of subject. The message was clear. The matter was not up for debate. My life continued to expand within a structure that valued restraint and accountability. Training intensified, responsibilities increased, and my focus sharpened. The more I leaned into my role, the less room there was for old dynamics to reassert themselves. Quiet strength became a habit reinforced daily. I did not celebrate his isolation, and I did not seek updates about it. Distance was not the goal. Integrity was. The refusal had drawn a line that could not be blurred by sentiment or pressure. Over time, Mark stopped reaching out entirely. The silence that replaced his messages was not peace, but it was stable. Emily adjusted by aligning herself more closely with my mother, stepping into a quieter role that required effort rather than attention. The family dynamic recalibrated around absence rather than dominance. I noticed that when my name came up in conversation, it was no longer accompanied by qualifiers or comparisons. It stood on its own. That shift mattered more than reconciliation. Forgiveness is often misunderstood as access restored, but in practice, it is an internal process that does not obligate exposure. I did not need to punish anyone to protect myself. I simply needed to be unavailable for manipulation. The cold refusal was not an act of defiance. It was an affirmation of agency. By declining to perform repair work for harm I did not cause, I allowed consequences to do what they are meant to do, teach limits and restore balance. Do you believe forgiveness requires access? The consequences did not arrive as a single decisive moment, but as a steady narrowing of access that reshaped everything around it. Mark was no longer invited to gatherings where he had once assumed his presence was expected. Invitations stopped arriving quietly without explanation, and conversations that had previously included him now happened elsewhere. When he did appear unexpectedly, he was met with polite distance and brief exchanges that offered no opening for control. The social authority he had relied on dissolved as people recalibrated their boundaries. It was not coordinated and it was not cruel. It was simply the natural result of trust being withdrawn. Emily experienced the consequences differently. She was still present at family events but no longer shielded by his voice. Without him directing attention toward her, she had to engage on her own, and that required effort she had never practiced. Some relationships faded while others shifted into something more neutral and honest. The hierarchy that had defined our family for years collapsed under its own imbalance. My mother struggled most with the change. She attempted to keep connections intact, organizing small gatherings and encouraging communication, but the strain was visible. Without Mark dominating the room, old tensions surfaced and long-ignored grievances emerged. Eventually, the effort to maintain appearances became exhausting and the gatherings stopped. What remained were individual relationships separated by distance and caution rather than proximity and obligation. This was what dissolution looked like, not dramatic confrontations, but quiet disengagement. I did not intervene, and I did not attempt to repair what had been built on imbalance. Some structures are not meant to be saved. As my family dynamic unraveled, I was preparing to step into my first assignment. Reporting instructions arrived along with schedules, expectations, and briefings that demanded my full attention. The transition was immediate and grounding. The unit environment was focused and practical, with no interest in personal history beyond what affected performance. I was introduced simply by name and rank, and that simplicity felt like relief. My responsibilities grew quickly, and with them, my confidence. Decisions mattered and outcomes were measured. The clarity of that environment reinforced the boundary I had drawn elsewhere. There was no space for manipulation and no tolerance for ambiguity. Each day, I showed up prepared and engaged, learning the rhythm of the unit and earning trust through consistency. The work required focus and accountability, and it offered something my family never had: structure that did not bend to personalities. As weeks turned into months, the distance between my old life and my new one widened naturally. Messages from home became infrequent and surface level. Mark did not contact me again. Emily sent occasional updates that were polite and detached. My mother tried to maintain connection but respected my boundaries when I did not respond immediately. The separation felt definitive. I grieved it briefly, not because I missed the dynamic, but because endings deserve acknowledgement. Then I moved on. The consequences had done their work. The family system that had thrived on comparison and control could not survive without participation. In my absence, it collapsed into something smaller and quieter. In my presence elsewhere, something stronger was taking shape. I learned that consequence is not about punishment, but alignment. When people lose access, they lose influence, and when influence fades, behavior changes or relationships end. I did not need to enforce anything beyond my own boundaries. The institution I served provided the framework, and my choices filled in the rest. As I settled into my role, I felt a steady sense of forward motion. The past no longer competed for attention. I had earned my place through effort and restraint, and I intended to honor that by moving ahead without carrying old weights. The consequences were complete, not because everyone agreed, but because the system no longer revolved around the same center. I had stepped into a life defined by earned authority, and in doing so, I left behind a family dynamic that could not adapt. 6 months after the commissioning ceremony, the memory of that day no longer arrived with heat or urgency, but with a quiet clarity that surprised me. I was no longer measuring my progress against what had been taken or lost because my life had settled into a rhythm that did not require comparison. I had been in my unit long enough now to understand the expectations and to meet them without constant recalibration. My days began early and ended when the work was done, not when attention ran out. I learned the personalities of the people around me, their strengths, their limits, and the unspoken rules that governed trust. As a junior officer, I listened more than I spoke, and when I spoke, it was because something needed to be decided. There was no applause for competence and no tolerance for excuses. That environment suited me. Authority here was quiet and functional, not something you performed for an audience. It existed to move things forward and nothing more. I did not tell stories about my family or the ceremony, and no one asked. My rank was sufficient context. The uniform was not a shield or a trophy, it was simply what I wore to do the work I had trained for. That simplicity felt like freedom. I noticed changes in myself that had nothing to do with confidence and everything to do with peace. I slept better. I stopped rehearsing conversations in my head. I no longer braced for interruption when I spoke. The constant background noise of anticipation and defense had faded. I was not proving anything anymore. I was just doing my job. Occasionally, something would remind me of the past, a phrase, a tone of voice, a moment where someone tried to assert control without substance. Each time I recognized it quickly and responded with distance rather than engagement. That reflex had become instinct. I did not feel the need to explain myself or to correct narratives that were no longer relevant. The ceremony and everything that followed had closed a chapter I had been trying to finish for years. My family life had settled into something sparse but manageable. I spoke to my mother occasionally in short conversations that avoided old patterns. She sounded calmer now that the pressure to mediate had lifted. Emily kept her distance, and when she reached out, it was with restraint and neutrality. Mark remained absent. I did not wonder what he thought or whether he regretted anything. His silence was not an unanswered question. It was an outcome. I had learned that closure does not always arrive with acknowledgement. Sometimes it arrives with absence. That realization brought relief rather than loss. The space he once occupied in my thoughts was now filled with more practical concerns, training schedules, evaluations, mentorship responsibilities. I had been assigned a small team, and the weight of that responsibility grounded me further. Their success mattered more than my history. I found satisfaction in watching them grow in confidence and capability, knowing that leadership was not about being seen, but about being reliable. I remembered the general's words about earned authority and saw them reflected daily in the way decisions were made and respected. No one needed to be diminished for the system to function. It simply required consistency and accountability. There was no moment where I felt like I had won. There was no dramatic turning point that marked victory. Instead, there was a gradual easing of tension and a steady accumulation of trust. That was enough. I had not reclaimed power from anyone because it had never belonged to them in the first place. I had simply stepped into my own life fully and left behind the need to justify it. On quiet evenings when the work was done, I sometimes thought about the younger version of myself who learned to stay small to survive. I wished I could tell her that she would one day stand in a place where silence was a choice rather than a necessity. That peace would come not from being seen, but from being aligned. I did not feel bitterness toward my family, and I did not feel gratitude for what had happened. I felt neutral, which was perhaps the most telling outcome of all. The past no longer pulled at me. It existed as context, not weight. The ceremony had been a catalyst, but not a climax. The real resolution came afterward in the ordinary days where nothing dramatic happened and everything worked as it should. That was where dignity lived, in routine, in restraint, in the ability to move forward without dragging old stories behind you. I had earned my place not just in rank, but in my own life. The quiet that surrounded me now was not absence, it was space. And in that space, there was freedom to choose how much access anyone had to me and to my future. If you have lived through something like this where peace arrived only after you stopped explaining yourself, where are you watching from? If you have made it this far, I want to pause the story here, not to sell you anything and not to ask for blind agreement, but to ask you to sit with what you just witnessed and measure it against your own life. Stories like this resonate not because they are dramatic, but because they reflect patterns many people recognize but rarely name out loud. Maybe you were the quiet one in your family, the one who learned early that speaking up only made things worse, so you learned to observe instead. Maybe you were compared constantly to someone who was celebrated by default while your effort passed unnoticed. Maybe you were told directly or indirectly that certain paths were not meant for you, and you believed it for longer than you should have. If that is you, then this story is not about revenge or humiliation, or even justice in the way movies frame it. It is about what happens when you stop negotiating your worth with people who benefit from minimizing it. Many viewers, especially those who have lived long enough to see patterns repeat, understand that the most damaging dynamics are not loud or violent. They are persistent, subtle, and socially accepted. Favoritism dressed up as pride. Control disguised as concern. Authority claimed without accountability. The reason moments like this commissioning ceremony matter is not because someone was embarrassed publicly, but because a system that values standards over personalities stepped in quietly and did what families often cannot. It drew a boundary without emotion. It applied rules evenly. It removed access instead of arguing intent. That is why so many people find relief in watching authority function correctly. It restores a sense of order that may have been missing elsewhere. If you are watching this and feeling something tighten in your chest, it may be because you recognize the cost of staying silent for too long. Silence can be survival, but it should not be a permanent state. There comes a point where silence becomes a choice, and choosing it means you are no longer protecting yourself, but preserving someone else's comfort. This story is not suggesting that everyone needs to confront their family or cut ties dramatically. It is suggesting something quieter and more sustainable. Boundaries are not punishments. They are filters. They decide who gets access to your time, your energy, and your future. Forgiveness does not require reopening doors that lead to the same harm. Peace is not earned by proving someone wrong. It is earned by no longer needing their approval. If you have ever walked into a room already braced for dismissal, if you have ever rehearsed explanations no one asked for or carried guilt for refusing to clean up messes you did not make, then you understand the deeper message here. The turning point is not when someone else changes. It is when you stop performing. That shift often looks boring from the outside. No shouting, no dramatic speeches, just consistency and distance. That is why it works. I want to invite you not to judge the characters in this story, but to reflect on your own patterns. Who do you keep explaining yourself to? Who benefits when you stay quiet? Who assumes access without accountability? These questions are uncomfortable, but they are clarifying. You do not need permission to step into a space that values your effort. You do not need to announce your boundaries for them to exist. Sometimes the strongest move is to let systems work and to step out of the cycle entirely. If this story resonated with you, consider sharing where you are watching from not as a roll call but as a reminder that these experiences are not isolated. People across cities, states, and generations recognize this dynamic because it is woven into many families' workplaces and communities. There is comfort in knowing you are not alone, and there is strength in seeing restraint modeled rather than outrage. If you want to continue exploring stories like this, stories where justice is quiet, where authority is earned, and where peace arrives without spectacle, then stay with this channel. Not for the drama, but for the perspective. For the reminder that dignity does not require an audience, and that freedom often begins the moment you stop explaining yourself. If you have lived this or something close to it, where are you watching from?